Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week starts off a brand new month, which means it's once again time to get back into Spawn with Spawn number 46. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in April of 1996, we can see Spawn featured front and center on the cover. This cover, of course, as well as all of the interior artwork, done by Kevin Conrad and Tony Daniel. This is a fantastic cover. We've got all this detail in the cape, this cool big glowing green orb surrounding Spawn's hand, showing off his powers. And despite the fact that this image really has nothing to do with the story on the interior of this issue, I still really like it. It's just that good. They really kind of knocked it out of the park with this one. Story, Todd McFarlane. Pencils, Tony Daniel. Inks, Kevin Conrad. Copy editor and letters, Tom Orzechowski. Color, Todd Broker, Roy Young. The story begins in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, where we see a single home as a black car pulls up into the driveway. Inside the home, a young family is sitting down to dinner, and the man is listening to a story from his wife about something very funny that their young baby has done during the day. The two of them are very much enjoying themselves when suddenly there's a ring at the door. The husband screams, "I'll get it," very loudly and abruptly, and his wife is kind of confused as she says, "Why? Who is it?" We see him open the door to two shadowy figures, and he states, "It's nobody, I'll take care of it, just go back and sit down." Upon opening the door, the man, whose name we find out is actually John, is greeted by two mafia goons, and we then find out that all three of these men actually work for Tony Twist. The large man with the sunglasses tells John that Mr. Twist is actually rather upset with him at the moment and has some things that he wants to discuss with him about his current work habits. John is rather taken back by this as he states, "Listen, guys, I've had a lot going on at home with the wife and the new baby. I can explain everything." He's then told that the men are supposed to bring him in for a meeting with Mr. Twist. However, this is of course totally voluntary. John tries to state that he'll talk to him tomorrow, but the man then tells him, "Well, I'm sure Mr. Twist is going to be really disappointed to hear that you won't come in tonight." Very disappointed, in fact, as he brandishes a pistol. At this point, John starts to realize that he doesn't have much of a choice as he says, "Okay, but not here in front of the wife and kid." His wife then comes up and asks him what's going on, and he tries to play the whole thing off, stating, "It's just some stuff that has to be taken care of tonight at work. I've got to go in and handle all this now, but don't worry, I'll be back." His wife then asks, "Well, okay, but how late?" He tells her, "I'm not certain, but don't wait up. Make sure that you tuck Susie in and give her a kiss and get a good night's sleep." And then he tells her as he leaves, "You look beautiful tonight, by the way." He's then led to a car by the two goons who tell him he's made the right choice in coming along with them. And as he approaches the car, a man in the back seat named Mr. Brewy tells him, "I'd appreciate it if you'd sit up front for me tonight." John gets into the front seat and sits patiently waiting, and after about a minute he asks, "Why aren't we moving?" Suddenly, a gun barrel is placed to the side of his head as we hear a loud blam from outside of the car. We then see the men inside of the car toss his lifeless body out into the street and then drive off. His wife runs to the street hysterically crying as she sees her husband's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. And it's hours before she's calmed down. And of course, there's not anywhere close to enough evidence for the police to really figure out what happened or who to go after, as this all just kind of falls through the cracks. Meanwhile, back in the city, in the office of one Tony Twist, he's delighted that the orders that he's given have been carried out to the letter. He wanted John dead because he's convinced that John was stealing from him, and he also wanted to send a message to anyone else that was his accomplice. He believes that there were multiple people involved in this plot, and given that most of the people that worked alongside of John live in that neighborhood, he wanted to make sure that they all got the message loud and clear. He tells both of his enforcers that they've done a great job, and he also wants them to keep an eye out on the rest of the neighborhood to see who makes any weird moves and make sure that they track down the other people who were involved in this plot to steal money from him. They are happy to oblige as they leave his office, but upon leaving, Mr. Twist then gets a phone call from the Sicilian mob and one man who is working on the behalf of Mr. Bartino. He tells Twist that Mr. Bartino is actually quite upset at not having overt kill returned to him at this point, and that they're starting to run out of patience, and that Twist really needs to get overt kill back to the Sicilian mob before they come to New York and deal with this matter personally. They then hang up the phone and leave Twist in his office to realize that he's got a serious problem on his hands, as we of course know that overt kill has been destroyed at this point, and he has nothing to offer up to the Sicilian mob, meaning he's in real trouble if they try to call in on, making sure he pays them back in loaning their cyborg enforcer out to him. We're then teleported to Rat City, the system of New York alleyways that Spawn calls home. And we see that the panels are slowly zooming in on a very specific dumpster, that being the one that Spawn deposited all of the worms that he brought with him back from West Virginia. Now, all nocturnal creatures do contain some form of evil energy, as per the story that we've had so far. But according to what we learn here, worms in particular carry a very concentrated version of this energy, as they are subterranean, meaning that they've never been tainted by the light, and are, as it states in this issue, bottled sin. We see a rat trying to nourish itself by eating some of the worms, but then Spawn grabs the rat and throws it away, protecting the worms so that he can feed upon them. He plans on using all of the energy that these worms are producing to replenish his costume and himself without having to use up any of his own power. But despite this being technically a good idea in terms of conserving his own energy, we're still left wondering whose idea exactly was this? Was this Al Simmons, aka Spawn's idea, or the idea of his living costume? The costume itself trying to vie for control over his body, and Cagliostro has warned him that he can't let that happen. However, Spawn seems rather determined in his mission to grow these worms into a crop of bottled sin, and he doesn't even notice that there's a few homeless men coming up behind him who are curious as to what he has going on. As the two men approach, they are terrified when Spawn turns around and his face is covered in the worms, his eyes glowing, and the men run in terror, screaming as they can't believe what they've just seen. Meanwhile, this entire interaction was witnessed by none other than Cagliostro himself, who is quite worried that Spawn is losing control over his body and that the costume will soon be the one calling the shots. Meanwhile, in Queens, New York, we are then teleported to the home of Wanda Blake and Terry Fitzgerald, as Wanda is going over all of the final paperwork for the expansion to the children's wing of the hospital that they now have all the funding for. Of course, this money was donated by Jason Wynn anonymously, and we're still not entirely certain what his plans are and why he would do this on behest of the Violator. We see then that Cyan calls out for her father, and Wanda tells her that Daddy won't be home for a while when suddenly Terry walks through the door. She's actually quite surprised to see that he's home so early, but he tells her that he's still feeling pretty terrible and that the illness that he has is really kicking the crap out of him. Wanda is starting to worry as she tells him that their family doctor has really insisted that he come in and get checked out, and Terry tries to brush it off, stating that he'll try and make an appointment next week. Terry then walks in and scoops up his young daughter to give her a hug and play with her as he asks Wanda how things are going with the hospital. She explains that all of the permits are now in order and that everything's set to get going next week. Terry then asks, "You still don't actually know who gave you all that money, do you?" And Wanda responds by stating that she doesn't and guesses that some people are just shy and, don't want to take credit for good deeds. After playing with his daughter, Terry excuses himself and goes back to he and Wanda's bedroom. As he sits on the edge of the bed, we find out that he's actually been hiding how sick he truly is from his wife, as he coughs and hacks on the edge of the bed, and even thinks to himself that he feels awful. He lies back on the bed and falls asleep, and we find out that things might be getting a lot worse for Terry than he's letting on, and Wanda is somewhat oblivious. Meanwhile, back in the city proper, we see that one of the men who was responsible for killing John earlier is leaving a sports bar. This man goes by the name on the street of Orca. This is because he's a whale of a man and a real killer. So it's Orca. Get it? Killer whale? And yes, Todd does go to the trouble of fully explaining the joke in this panel. As he makes his way to his car, we learn that he's actually one of Twist's top enforcers, and that he has absolutely no problem with taking people out for Twist and never questions any of his orders. In fact, he's so good at killing that at this point he's lost track of the bodies when suddenly he turns around and sees some claws, and we then see through a shadow that he is flying backward through the air in a sea of blood, and we learn that the body count that he had racked up has now been capped. Early the next morning, one of the other enforcers who was with Orca the night that they took out John is trying to collect protection money from one Mr. Garbone. However, Garbone doesn't have his money, and this is infuriating the goon who works for Twist. He's unnamed, so I can't tell you exactly what I should be calling him. He decides that he's going to go find the money on his own as he goes into the back storeroom. He even thinks to himself, however, that this is really out of character, and Garbone never actually comes short on the protection money. He just pays it and goes about his business. So as he looks through the back of the store, he's not certain exactly what he's going to find. He then sees some movement and believes it is a dog of some kind, when suddenly he realizes that's not the case, and as he screams out the word no, he is suddenly silenced in a shower of blood. We are then teleported back to the office of Tony Twist, who is enraged at the fact that two of his men have been taken out and that somebody is trying to start a turf war with him. He exclaims that this will not be tolerated and that he wants whoever it is found and dealt with tonight. Not tomorrow, not a week from now, tonight. He then tells the two men who are standing with him that have brought a box to his desk that they need to get out in the streets and also find some new blood to take the place of the two men he's lost, as he's a little bit short on protection. As we see, it's their heads that are inside of the box, delivered with a tag that says to Tony Twist, as it's very clear that whoever has killed these two men has a real bone to pick with Twist, and he wants Twist to know for certain that that's the case. Meanwhile, back in Rat City, Spawn and Cagliostro are having a heated conversation as Cog is not convinced at all that Spawn managed to kill an angel. Spawn explains that after the animals stripped all the flesh off of her, she was nothing more than a pile of bones. She's dead. However, at this point, Cog explains to Spawn that angels don't have bones, that their bodies are made up of some sort of plasm, the same way that his is, and that the only way to actually kill an angel is to absorb their light, which he didn't do. This means that the angel he fought, who is Tiffany by the way, however she's still not actually been named within the pages of Spawn at this point, is still alive, and that she can be anywhere as she's probably still coming for him. Cog explains to Spawn then that angels are capable of shape-shifting, so she could take on any form, one of the homeless men, one of a police officer, literally anyone. And Spawn starts to get frustrated and states, well, what am I supposed to do then? Cog explains to him, you're supposed to fight for what's right. Remember, you came back here to try and be with your wife once again. That was your whole reason for making the deal with Mabalja. And you've somehow forgotten about that. Why are you no longer trying to go after that? Spawn tries to play it off and explain to Cog that it's not that simple. What about the other players that are in this game? Angela, Jason Wynn, the Violator. How do they play into all of this? Cog tells him that they're all pieces to this puzzle and that he's going to have to figure this out. He's also going to have to realize that the human he was is no longer exactly who he is now. He's not going to be a man again. He's forever going to be a hellspawn. So he needs to accept that and wrestle control over the costume. However, Spawn argues that if he ever gives up on the idea of him being human, that psychologically it's going to make him crack and that he can't let go of that humanity that's still within him. So Cagliostro tells him, well, don't then. Cog then explains to Spawn that while he doesn't need to give up on his humanity, he does need to continue to fight, and also keep in mind that all of his actions have repercussions, and that if he just acts on instinct, everything is going to spin out of control, which is exactly what Hell wants. Hell wants him to be confused, angry, and vicious and act on instinct alone. He then tells Spawn that so far he's been playing right into their hands, like with all of these worms that he pulls a handful out of the dumpster. He then tells Spawn, you know what these are for, right? It's so that your costume can siphon evil energy away from them and use it to nourish itself, and that's what your costume wants, and it's the one calling the shots. Spawn tries to explain that he does need them, and Cog actually confirms this. Yes, you do. However, you need to do it on your terms, not the terms of the costume, not allowing it to be the one that's in charge. If you want to remain a man, you're the one who has to be in charge of all of this. We're then teleported to a seedy motel on the other side of town, where one of Twist's men by the name of Vinny has just enjoyed an evening with two ladies of the night. He tells them that it was really nice having two at the same time, and they state that, yeah, they had a good time too. He then gets up, and one of the girls asks, where are you going? He then tells her, I gotta take a dump, to which she replies, how romantic. As he sits on the toilet, he suddenly hears something and thinks to himself, what exactly was that? I couldn't have farted that hard. However, before he can even make a sound, there's a huge crash as something grabs him and yanks him through the wall into the alleyway behind the building. It's at this point we find out that the individual who's been waging a one-man war against Twist and his men is none other than Tremor. Now, we haven't seen Tremor in quite some time, and I'm happy to see that he's back, as he is one of my favorite characters within the pages of Spawn. He tells Vinny that Vinny has some information that he needs and that the two of them are going to be taking care of some business together. This, of course, is terrifying to Vinny, who immediately fills the bowl that he's still sitting on. We're then teleported to the home of Tony Twist later that evening, as Twist is having a drink and also contemplating everything that's going on, being very angry at the fact that there's no respect anymore, and that someone is trying to muscle in on his territory. However, when he turns around, he is greeted by the horrid face of Tremor, who says, good evening, Twist, as Twist just screams Jesus and drops his drink. Tremor then grabs Twist and lifts him into the air by his shirt and states, you know, Twist, your men are getting weak. There was a point in time which these men would have died before they ever betrayed you, but now they seem to be willing to give you up at a moment's notice. Tony looks over and sees that Vinny is tied to a column in the room, and he states, Vinny, you traitor, but Vinny tells him that he didn't have a choice. However, Vinny did have a choice, and it was to die by the hands of Tremor, and this is exactly what Tremor was getting at. The men who work for Twist aren't as loyal as they once were, as we see they are willing to betray him if you threaten their lives. Tremor then explains to Twist that he got Vinny to talk by threatening him with torture and death, and that he learned that from Twist, because that's exactly what Twist did to him to get him to agree to all of the experiments that turned him into this giant monster. Twist threatened his wife and family, and despite the fact that Tremor, aka Richard, which is his real name, went along with everything that Twist asked, Twist still killed his wife and kids to tie up any loose ends, and that today is his day for payback. However, Twist simply laughs and tells him, yeah, maybe your wife and kids are dead, but your brother David is still alive, and if you want to keep him that way, you're going to let me go, because there's instructions for him to be killed if anything strange were to ever happen to me. Tremor is shocked and throws Twist onto the other side of the room and calls him a liar. However, he then squints and looks at Twist as he turns and grabs the pillar that Vinny is tied to and rips it out of the building. At this point, Twist starts to taunt him, stating, you were always a failure, Richard. You were a failure at being a hitman. You're failing to kill me now, and you even messed up all of the experiment that we spent so much time and money on. At this point, Tremor immediately tells him to shut up and walks out of the building carrying the pillar that Vinny is still tied to. Despite the fact that he doesn't want to believe it, he knows that Twist is telling the truth and that his brother David is still in fact alive, despite him thinking that that was not the case. And that if he wants to keep him alive, he's going to have to get some help to take on Twist as he walks off into the night with Vinny in tow. One of Twist's bodyguards then enters the room and asks Twist, why did you let him get away? And Twist tells him it's because we need to prepare for when he returns so that we can take him alive. Cicely wants Overt Kill back, and with a few modifications to Tremor, we can give them a new and improved version, one that does not have the burden of a human brain to contend with. So we learn now that Twist actually intends on using Tremor to get himself out of trouble and return him to Cicely as the newest version of Overt Kill. Back in the alleyways, we see Spawn turn as he is surprised by the presence of a familiar face, that of Tremor, as he walks around the corner of one of the buildings. Holding Vinny in his hand, he states, Spawn, I need your help. Spawn, however, is rather upset by this intrusion into his territory as he yells at Tremor, where do you get off? However, Tremor tells him to be quiet and that he knows that Twist is his problem, but that he thought Spawn might be interested in a few names that Vinny gave up during his interrogation. Vinny lists off the names then of Wanda Blake, Terry Fitzgerald, Cyan Fitzgerald, and Jason Wynn. As we see Spawn's brow furl, Tremor realizes that Spawn is now intrigued and is going to be more than willing to help him out, as he asks him, so what do you say, partner, as we reach the end of the story. We then get to the image info section. This one is actually more just about an autograph signing that Todd did at Kim Kalamiajek's comic book trading card action figure store in Puyallup, Washington. I don't know if I'm saying any of this. Again, last name Kalamiajek and the city in Washington, Puyallup. Apparently, this store was owned by Todd's brother-in-law, and I'm actually kind of interested if any of you watching were ever at this store or if it still exists to this day. Please feel free to talk about it in the comments section below. I'd like to know what your experiences were and if you happen to ever go to one of these autograph signings that Todd McFarlane did. It was pretty cool of him to show up to his brother-in-law's comic book store and do this. And I'm sure it would have been a really cool experience for anyone who lived there to be able to get autographs signed by as big a name as Todd McFarlane at such a small, comic book store that was just in a little town in Washington. We then reach the spawning ground, this of course being the letter section where fans could submit letters to be answered by Todd McFarlane himself in the hopes of having them printed in an issue of Spawn. And there were a few ones that were interesting in this month's issue, one of which was when Todd revealed during a response to a letter that Keith David would be the man voicing Spawn for the animated series on HBO. This, I believe, was actually the first reveal of that being the case. Now, Keith David, of course, not the biggest star in Hollywood, but it was actually really cool that he was the one voicing Spawn. And in my opinion, he did an outstanding job. He is, in all accounts, as far as I'm concerned, the voice of Spawn. And I was really happy when they brought him back to voice Spawn in the Mortal Kombat game. I believe it was Mortal Kombat 1 that Spawn was in. That was super cool that, Keith was willing to do that again and that they had the wherewithal to just, grab the guy that everyone would associate with the voice of Spawn to voice the character once again 30 odd years later. That was awesome. We then get another letter in which someone asks what exactly the little guys that Curse had with him were, if they were Izzes or if they were some kind of little gremlin. And at this point, Todd explains that these are all creatures that Curse built from hand. They're not actual, living beings that he altered. He actually designed them and created them in his lab, which is actually kind of a cool story point because otherwise they really don't make any sense. So explaining it as, a science experiment that Curse did on his own is really, in my opinion, the best way to explain them. And then the most interesting letter I found in all of this was one where someone asked why exactly he decided to make the character of Al Simmons a black man. Now, it's important to point out that the person who wrote that letter in does identify themselves as being African American themselves, and that they were very happy that he created an African American superhero, but they were interested in what his thought process behind the whole thing was. Todd goes on to explain that the reason that he decided to make Al Simmons black was because this was something that would allow him to have the opportunity to have deeper storytelling that could bring light to and explore themes that involved racism and race relations on a different level and a different perspective that would have normally just fallen on a white person seeing racism from the outside versus a black person who's experiencing racism directly. And I thought that was a really interesting idea and pretty progressive for when he created this character all the way back in like 91, 92. So you can kind of see how Todd had a lot of foresight with what he wanted to do with this story and the character of Spawn as a whole. The next 2 pages, of course, feature some Spawn pinups. The first is uncredited, and this is an airbrush picture. Airbrush is a fickle mistress. I have some friends who are some pretty talented airbrush artists, and what I've learned from them is that it's a very difficult medium to use in all aspects. It's easy to do if you're just like doing t-shirts and that kind of thing, but when you're trying to do like really detailed stuff, you have to be very careful when you're working with it to make sure that you don't create what we're seeing here, which is kind of a washed out type of film over all of the colors. And unfortunately, whoever did this picture kind of fell into that trap. And the sad thing is, the picture itself is actually not that bad. It's just that the detail and the colors seem to be a little bit lacking, and everything feels just slightly off. The second pinup is done by a man named Aaron, how am I supposed to say this? Laprisetti, I believe. And of course, this is of medieval Spawn riding a horse, carrying a damsel in distress, cutting the head off of a skeleton. It's not bad, and I really do like the subject matter of it, as the horse is jumping over an entire battlefield by the looks of it. And this was a really fun image, even if it's not the most, high-level detailed image we've ever seen in the pinups that have been printed in the pages of Spawn. I feel like it's still really good nonetheless. We then reach the end cap, where we get updates about McFarlane Toys. However, the end cap in issue number 46 here is the exact same end cap that was printed in issue number 45. So if you want to know my thoughts about this, just go back and watch what I said about it in my episode on issue number 45, because there's no sense in me repeating myself for this episode. We then get 2 pages of the Spawn Direct mail-away service. I've talked about this at length multiple times, so I'm not going to bore you all again with talking about it today. On the final page of the book, we get an advertisement for X-Files comic books. Now, truth be told, I have never read any of these comic books, as I was never the biggest X-Files fan. Not that I had any problem with the show, it just never really piqued my interest. So I don't have a whole lot to say about these comics, but if you read any of them, feel free to talk about them in the comments below. I'd like to know more about them and if they were any good. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for the Spawn website, spawn.com. Now, this website does still in fact exist today, but it was a pretty big deal to announce that you had a official website back in 1996, which is why Todd went to the trouble of printing out a full-page ad in the pages of Spawn to get the word out to all of the fans that they could log on with their 56K dial-up modems and check out Spawn.com. And that was Spawn number 46. And overall, I think that this was a terrific issue. We get a lot more information about Spawn's costume and him trying to control it while it's trying to drive him to feed off of evil energy from nocturnal creatures, which, as I've stated before, I think is not all that cool of a story point in Spawn's lore, because it doesn't really make a ton of sense if you think about it with any sort of depth, especially when many of these nocturnal creatures also exist within the daylight as well. We also get interesting story points of Cog telling Spawn what he needs to worry about and how he needs to go about doing things so that the costume doesn't take control over his body. We also learn really important information about the angels and their physiology and what it takes to actually kill one of them, and that Tiffany is likely still alive, as she was just trying to use the appearance of her skeleton to fool Spawn so that she could survive the encounter. We also get the reemergence of Tremor and get a side story involving his quest for vengeance against Tony Twist. And we also are now seeing how Spawn is beginning to learn that there's a lot more going on with Twist and Wynn and Cyan and Wanda and Terry than he realized. And that if he wants to keep them safe, he's going to have to get involved in all of this, whether he wants to or not. So really, in my opinion, just a fantastic issue front to back. But your opinions may be different. You may think that none of this stuff about Spawn's lore was necessary. You may not like the character of Tremor and are not happy to see him reemerge in the story. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.